The latest and greatest in general practice. We're going to be covering exactly that in this episode, including some of the major stories that have been happening over the past couple of years, including strike, and some good news stories as well. So let's get set as we tech enhance your primary care and learning. Hello, EGP learners, and welcome to this blisteringly cold Saturday morning as we get ready to talk about what's basically happening in general practice over the past couple of weeks, not years. See, time's already going by for me, isn't it, Andy?
Days.
Yeah. Days. Okay, fine, days. Let's stick with days. There's a reason why I'm slightly displaced in time. We've just landed back in the country a couple of days ago. But how are you doing there, Andy, first of all?
Yeah, I'm pretty good over here. Looking forward to having our Saturday morning clinic, talking about what's happening in the world of general practice and health technology news. It's been an interesting 2 weeks while you've been away, Gandhi, in that there's not been a great deal happen apart from strike news, it seems. So I guess that'll dominate what we're talking about this morning, talking about the junior doctor strike. There's talk of whether GPs can strike or not. There's been a bit of movement on the nursing striking. The paramedics did go on strike again. And then at the end, we've got a little story that we've queued up about artificial intelligence and whether AI can write a plan to save general practice. So that's, I guess, what to expect this morning. Yeah, how do you want to handle all of this morning, Andy?
Well, I think we're going to jump into the big meaty stuff, which is the strikes. But just before we do that, it's interesting to note that there is one news story that hasn't happened yet that we've been anticipating for a while. And that's the GP Access report still hasn't been released. So this is the report that has been long commented by the government that is due to come in terms of telling us basically all the changes that need to happen in general practice and stuff. I think it is important for us to note this hasn't arrived yet. We're still waiting for it to come through. So we had hoped that we could cover this for you. It was due to drop in January. We're almost to the end of February and it's still not arrived. Interesting the fact that it hasn't been released yet, and obviously that coming shortly as well, they have just announced, is the workforce report for the NHS as well, which that is now apparently going to be released in the next few weeks as well, and that's been waited for about 2 years, I believe, or something crazy like that. So some big reports to come. We'll hopefully be covering them for you on EGP Learning as soon as they come out. But yeah, let's get cracking with the strike stuff, shall we, Andy?
Yes. So, I mean, where to start, really? Lots of healthcare professionals, it's strike season, isn't it? Lots of healthcare professionals have been talking about strike or been out on strike. I guess the big news that's that dropped in the last few weeks is that junior doctors have voted in favour of strike action. So there was a ballot of BMA junior doctor members that had a record turnout. So 77% of those eligible to vote voted. So huge numbers, and 98% were in favour of strike action. So that's pretty huge, I guess. Gandhi, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are some comments about this may be the strongest mandate for strike ever in union history. So when you work out the numbers and stuff, it works out to 75% of the eligible, cohort of people that could potentially vote on this have voted to strike, which is seismic in terms of the numbers itself. And whether it is the largest or not, it's pretty high up there. Let's put it that way. I mean, that's mentionable at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's worth just sort of backtracking a little bit and just highlighting some of the main reasons why the junior doctors are striking. I'm sure a lot of our audience are healthcare, professionals or connected to the healthcare sector. So this won't come as a great deal of news, but junior doctors' pay, like the pay of lots of us in the healthcare profession, has been pretty stagnant over the past decade or two, actually. Or there's been small pay increases, but but much less than inflationary pay increases. So junior doctors, for example, have had a 26% real terms cut in income since 2008. So in terms of what you could buy with your wage packet in 2008, you can buy 26% less goods because of the effect of inflation eroding any of those smaller pay increases that they've had. So that's one issue. Obviously, junior doctors worry about the care of patients and the provision of service to patients. And actually, they say there's just underinvestment in the NHS, and part of the reason why they're striking is to highlight that and encourage greater investment in services for the benefit and safety of patients. Well, I think those are probably the main reasons. Anything else popped out at you, Gandhi?
No, like you said, I think it's about conditions. It is about pay, but the reason why it's about pay is to make sure that people feel valued, but more importantly, that then they can provide enough staffing to actually can manage. I mean, we've heard many stories over the past few months and to be honest, even years where, individual doctors have been left managing workloads that are just not safe for patient care. And actually, quite rightly, many of our colleagues are turning around saying, this is just ridiculous. We're now into, almost 12 years of this going on. Something needs to change, and they've exhausted every other option available. So they feel the only thing left for them is to strike, really. It's interesting. Steve Barclay, is our Secretary of State for Health, obviously his comments were something along the lines that I think, what was it?
Oh, we hugely value the work of junior doctors, and it's deeply disappointing. Some union members have voted for strike action. I really like the use of the word "some" there, because it's
Yeah.
98% of those that voted. So I found that quite an amusing use of language there. Yeah, the other thing that I think is just worth acknowledging and marking as well, it depends on where our audience come from as to whether they will be aware of this. But I remember seeing on Twitter, actually, a junior doctor, I won't be able to find it, actually, unfortunately. We should have queued it up, but they shared their payslip on Twitter, quite a bold thing to do. And people were shocked that this person who worked in London, after all the kind of deductions for student loan and, his tax and his pension and so forth, and his payslip, was taking home about £1,600, a month, compared to the average rent in London where he was living. People were actually shocked, and actually the public thought that junior doctors earned more. And the other thing to mark as well, just about that, is I think the term junior doctors can be a little bit problematic, because people, I think, often think of people that are perhaps more like medical students or very, very junior doctors, but actually junior
Yeah.
doctor grades go right up to anything that is not a consultant. So when people are at the hospital and they're seeing, there's specialist registrar, for example, who
Yep.
is a very senior, very well qualified, very, very capable, and often fairly old, doctor, in their 30s,
Yeah.
probably with a family, house, mortgage. They are junior doctors, so we're not talking about, fresh-faced people straight out of university. These are really quite experienced people. And I don't think the public sort of understand that. I don't think the public understand just that the rates of pay are not necessarily as high as they might expect, compared to other professions and average pay in the UK, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and there are often comparisons made that, actually in the current state of play, you can potentially go and work in a supermarket and earn more than a doctor working on the wards at the moment in time. That's how significant things are now. That's not to belittle those working in supermarkets. They do an amazing job. And actually, we kind of need the supermarkets to keep life running and that kind of stuff. But that's just the discrepancy in terms of how things work and stuff, that people that are actively working quite significant prolonged shifts, as well as obviously trying to save people's lives, are not valued by the organizations, more importantly by the NHS, in terms of the work that they are doing to keep the health of our population going and stuff. So I think that's why many people feel that actually, like I said, we've got to that point where every other option has been exhausted. We're 12 years down the line and still nothing has changed. There just doesn't seem to be any shift in terms of what the government want to happen. And therefore, that's why many people have taken this decision to strike, basically. And it's going to be interesting. So the strikes are set for the 13th, 14th and 15th of March. There is some guidance sent out by the BMA in terms of who can and can't strike, because there are certain people that can't strike, as well as also what are those weird questions like, what happens if you're working nights on Sunday night? What does that mean? Because the first day is a Monday. There's various different things along this line. So there is some really good guidance sent out by the BMA. I don't know if it's worth showing it, Andy, on screen, some of the stuff that they put out and things.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got that queued up, Gandhi. You might need to give me a second in terms of on screen. But just a question, actually, while we do that. Will the GP registrars that you have at your practice be striking, do you think, on those days? They are a junior doctor. That feels like it might be a bit of a grey area. Was there any?
So according to the BMA,
Like that?
junior doctors that are working as GP trainees are eligible for striking. So that is based on whether or not they have a lead employer who is a contract holder within the NHS, which is probably majority of GP trainees, because a lot of GP training programs went to what's called the lead employer model, or even if they are employed by a GP practice, because the GP practice is thought to hold an NHS contract. That bit seems a bit unusual, because that has relevancy when it comes to GP striking, which is a separate part, which we're going to cover later on. But it does state, according to the BMA, if you have a single lead employer contract, or you hold a contract directly with a GP practice, or if you have both, then you can go on strike or take industrial action, as the official term is. I think important to note that there are certain categories that can't. So, for example, medical students cannot strike. The most important one is, in order to be able to take industrial action, you do need to be a BMA member. That is the key thing I think many people do need to remember. If you are not a BMA member, you are not eligible to go on industrial action.
Yeah, that's an important point actually, because and I'm not an expert on the legality of striking, but in order to strike, you need to do so as part of action, by your union. It needs to be part of official coordinated industrial action.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're in breach of your contract, and you as an individual are open to the sanctions, that can be levied against you for breach of contracts. So that might be gross misconduct, or dismissal from your contract and your training program. So people just need to be aware of that. And I know a number of people have been who might have drifted away from the BMA, have started to look up the BMA rates, and thinking about coming back into the fold so that they can take part in any future strike action that might happen. So yeah, interesting times. Again,
just to update people on that, if they were curious how much, so we had a quick look at how much it costs to be a member of the BMA. If you are being a full member, so either GP or consultant, then you're looking at approximately £39 per month. If you're looking at being from a junior doctor perspective, it does depend what year of training you're in. It can vary from approximately £10 per month up to about £30 per month, or £29 something pence and stuff, depending on the level of qualifications you have. And there are some discounts based on how much you earn as well and stuff. So do have a look at the BMA page if that's something you want to have a look at for more detail. But yeah.
Gandhi, I've got a question for you, because I remember the junior doctor strike some years ago now, that happened previously, and I think mixed results really from that. I think generally it didn't get a great deal of concession from the government, and I remember how it played out in the media, and the government gave the junior doctors a bit of a run for their money, really, in terms of winning hearts and minds in the media. Have you got any tips for junior doctors this time round about handling the media or social media? Do you think junior doctors care, this time round, or are they more desperate?
I think we're in a different situation for a start, and I think we're also, unlike previously, that was majority around the junior doctors. Obviously, the difference we have now is that actually there's many of the parts of the profession and the nation currently going on strike. This is not just a single unified action, and therefore that has an impact because of the level of, obviously we're hearing about nurses strike, we're hearing about paramedic strike, teachers strikes, everyone's striking because of how significant the situation is. So I think that will have some impact on the potential outcome. I think the key thing is, for any form of industrial action, there does need to be a unified voice. And there's always this discussion about some people going on and using these kind of opportunities to further, for example, their media careers or other kind of stuff. We saw that happen in the junior doctor strikes back in 2016, that some people became very prolific and may or may not have been part of the official party line kind of stuff in terms of how to mention things. But and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be useful because different voices are always valued. But it's important to remember that the whole point of industrial action is it's a unified action. And I think that's probably one of the key things. And it's one of the really interesting things why general practice has always struggled to strike, because there is not really a unified voice when it comes to that perspective. But we'll talk about that one later.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting, isn't it, getting that balance between, there being a central voice and, a coordinated line, and then individual actions like, that chap who shared his payslip, on Twitter. I thought that was really bold, and that had a real, a lot of impact. So there's something about people being just authentic and honest, and sharing their difficulties, making ends meet on salaries. It's a difficult one. I'll be really interested to see how it pans out, and other groups that might be wanting to take industrial action later. Even GPs, for example, will need to take note about managing public opinion. I guess we'll move on to news about the nursing strike now, and the news there is really that there was a statement from the RCN saying that they were going into intensive negotiations with the Department of Health and Steve Barclay, and that those were going to take place or begin on Wednesday, the 22nd of February. So that's already passed. I don't think we've heard of any outcome. Certainly there isn't anything on the RCN website about the outcome of that. So I guess that's still ongoing, but represents progress. You hear all sorts of rumors about, they're going to be offered 10% or, all sorts of things, which I think is interesting. Anything that the nurses are offered sets a bar for other striking groups, particularly in the health sector. So that it'll be really interesting to watch what emerges from these negotiations. Yeah. How do you think the RCN have handled their strike and, you know, come across media wise? And
I think they've been very clear about what they expect as an outcome and what they're willing to do, and that they are willing to talk to the government. Obviously, there's been, you know, different perspectives in terms of whether or not the government is speaking to the negotiators or not, and you know, it's been a bit of back and forth and stuff that's been happening. I think, you know, they've taken a clear line that this is around patient safety, and actually at the end of the day, whilst a lot of it focuses on pay, again, pay is a factor, but the reason why pay is important is because that does implicate patient safety, because actually we don't have enough people staying within the profession and staffing things and stuff. So that's why, you know, that needs to be the forefront of the discussion. It is still around patient safety, just patient safety in a different way that people who hold the purse strings probably think about it, because all they care about is bums on seats doing the work, you know. So
yeah, absolutely. Pay is an interesting one, isn't it? Because pay is about, you know, the individual's person's pay and what they can afford with their pay, and, you know, can they afford to live, you know, the life that they would want
yeah,
and that we would want them to live. And also there's just that the cold hard reality of attracting people into a job and keeping them in a job. You know, at some point the pay becomes a problem for the employers as well.
yeah.
You know, in terms of just keeping bums on seats. Um,
An interesting perspective, because we're going to talk again about this, but I guess you know, one of the key things that we haven't covered in our kind of pre-document is the fact that there was a released document about the DDRB recommendations for GP salary pay, which was 3.5% uplift. Now, the reason why that's been really controversial from a general practice perspective is the fact that general practice as a whole is only going to receive a 2.1% uplift, backdated from the 2019 contract negotiations that the government refuses to renegotiate until next financial year in 2024. So there's this whole question of, you know, you've got a 3.5% uplift, which you can still argue, is that enough? But the funding provided general practice isn't commensurate to cover that level of funding. So you are actively defunding general practice even more than it currently is being defunded.
Yes, well, we talked about that before. We'll talk about it again.
Yeah.
I suppose the other question we were starting to ask each other and is being asked is GPs and strike action, and, you know, can GPs even strike? You know, what might that look like? We decided to spin that out into a separate episode. So
Yeah.
so tune in next week as we try and pick some of those issues apart. But that's a really interesting topic with some difficulties, I
And
think.
unfortunately, it's not as simple as people think. So definitely join us for that episode, which we're probably going to release next week. And you'll be able to watch it in terms of understanding some of the real complexities around, can actually GP strike or not. So definitely join us for that. And just to point out, that episode is going to be our opinions. To clarify, we're not legal experts on any of this. So just a quick point on that. But yeah.
Good. And while we're talking about pay, there's been some interesting. We found an interesting article, didn't we, in GP Online, reflecting on the results of their sister publication, GP Business, who have done a survey of GP. It's not clear what the methodology or the numbers behind the survey were, but it's an interesting headline which highlights that GP locum rates have gone up. I guess shock horror, Gandhi.
Yeah.
What did you make of this?
So, like you say, it's a survey done by the readers of GP Online and their sister publication, GP Business, and effectively looking at the rates of pay. They suggest that inside of London, the rates of pay have increased by 9 to 11%, depending on the location. Outside of London, you're talking approximately 3 to 5%, I think it was, off memory. And that actually, in terms of reduction of work, many locums are still seeing generally an increase or ease of finding work, basically meaning there's a high demand for GP locums still. It breaks down the figures in a lot more detail, but the gist of the article is very much that GP locum rate pay is going up, which is interesting because majority of the respondents suggested that this wasn't actually an increase they've done in the past 6 months to a year, which is obviously where a lot of the cost of living impact has come in. So these are potentially increases that happened before that. So we may still see this pay increase further as things like the cost of living impact bites down, because important to remember that a lot of GP locums obviously paid as a self-employed nature, and therefore the impact of what that has in terms of your tax and all the other kind of stuff that you would do is actually quite delayed by almost 18 months. So take-home pay and various other things have an impact in some of that in terms of your tax income, your pensionable income, and all that kind of stuff. So we may see further increases in the future to compensate for the current issues in terms of cost of living and that kind of stuff. I know that sounds really complicated to some people. But yeah, money is complicated.
Yeah, just picking some of the figures off there. So they're saying between GP locum rates in England have risen between, so this must be one of the lower rates, sort of 3.2 in the Midlands, where we're practicing, to 9.1% in London, which is interesting that these figures are below the sorts of figures that a lot of the sort of junior doctors and nurses are asking for from the government. So it's just interesting where the figures are, I think, and that perhaps reflects their ability to charge, which reflects the ability of GP practices to pay and the willingness to pay, which there's more of a market at play in terms of the setting of rates here, rather than a system where the government sets the rates of pay, like many other parts of the general practice and healthcare workforce. But interesting article. Interesting.
And finally, we're talking about whether AI can save general practice. What do you think, Andy?
So this is my favorite article of the last 2 weeks. So it's one of the Pulse sort of columnists. So full credit to Pulse. They use Chat GPT. So you've done a really interesting talk with Keith Grimes about Chat GPT and the use of AI and chatbots in general practice. Are really, really interesting. I enjoyed listening to that. And part of that, you're talking about what are going to be the applications, for general practice. What are going to be the applications for healthcare? So what he tried to do was use it to write health policy effectively, but to make it a little bit more interesting, he asked ChatGPT to write two fictional stories, and one was about how NHS England caused the failure of general practice. And it's quite a short, response. We won't read through that one.
But we will link it in the description, so do check out the links if you want to go direct to the article and stuff. Alternatively, obviously, you can Google or search for it.
Yeah, I think it's actually really accurate. It really accurately describes what has actually happened in the last few years. Actually, it's really, really interesting. And then he asked, please write a fictional story of how NHS England rescued and restored general practice. And the response is really, really quite simple, quite logical, common sense, and sounds like it would probably work. So the AI.
Give us the highlights, Andy, in terms of how we can save general practice from Chat GPT's perspective.
So first of all, the first bit says how NHS England realised the value and the contribution of general practice to the smooth running of the health system overall, which is really, really uplifting. And then suggests three interventions. So first, they increased funding to general practice, allowing more GPs to be hired and giving them the resources they needed to provide better care to their patients. They also invested in technology such as telemedicine and electronic health records to make it easier for GPs to communicate with each other and provide more coordinated care. Two, next, they implemented measures to reduce the administrative burden on GPs, allowing them to spend more time with their patients. This included hiring more administrative staff to handle paperwork and streamlining processes to reduce bureaucracy. Finally, they implemented measures to support the mental health and well-being of GPs, recognizing that they were under immense pressure and needed support. This included counselling services and peer support networks. And that sounds, those are quite simple things that it suggests, but sometimes headline strategy is pretty simple, and then actually the complexity is about how you make sure that you can fund that and how you actually implement and deliver that. So I think actually it's headline policy. That's pretty good, and it's not what the government's been doing. Not increasing funding to core general practice, and certainly not implementing measures to reduce administrative burden. I mean, the ask for administrative input and leadership input from GPs has been huge over the past few years. And supervision for other staff types, and and all sorts of things. But it's suggesting a different approach and supporting GPs to look after their patients and spend more time with their patients. So I thought that was good. Yeah, what did you make of this story or this application of AI, Gandhi?
I really like using ChatGPT. I've been using it quite a lot over the past few weeks, particularly to do a lot of the social media stuff that I do and to basically save myself time. And I found it really helpful. I think it's interesting that, the whole premise of OpenAI is that it uses the language models of the internet. So this is the knowledge that exists out there, and it summarizes it, in particular in this situation, to come out with three really obvious really simple outcomes that would probably have a significant impact on general practice. Like you say, the devil is, as ever, and we have always heard this, the devil is always in the detail, and it's how do you make that actually functional. But in terms of a premises, valuing your workforce, paying them appropriately, and reducing bureaucracy to make sure they can actually do the work and spend more time with patients. How is that not the best way to fix general practice? So yeah, I came up with the
Yeah.
obvious answer. Fine, great. It'd be interesting to see whether or not that is actually taken forward, though.
Yeah, which it probably won't be. But so Gandhi, it's helpful to think about what's going on when we ask the ChatGPT or similar large language models these things. So my understanding is that kind of what you get back is sort of the collective viewpoint of the source material, and I think this is largely trained on the internet and other sources, books, articles, things that aren't freely directly accessible on the internet. So huge amounts of language and wisdom. So I guess what we're getting back is this sort of collective wisdom of the internet on a topic, I guess.
Mhm.
So it's just worth recognizing that's what we're getting. We're not necessarily
Yeah.
getting new thoughts or innovative thoughts. Am I
No.
right in that
Yeah,
sort of
no.
assumption, Gandhi?
So that's correct. Important to note, ChatGPT in particular is focused on the internet pre some point in 2019, I think it is. So it
That's right. I
doesn't.
tried to ask it for something modern. I think I said summarize the news in general practice in the last 2 weeks. I asked it this morning, and it said,
Mm,
"I'm sorry, I can't do that. I can't comment on anything after 2019."
yeah.
Gosh, that's not any good.
So important to note, it's only relevant for 2019. So actually pre-COVID, if you wanted a landmark in terms of understanding that. So there is that
A lot's
important.
been written on general practice since then as
Hell
well.
yeah,
Lots of columnage
especially by
in
us. But yeah, I think important to recognise that it has its limitations. It's great as a templated guide, and I know there's lots of discussion around obviously using AI in terms of academia, policy, all that kind of stuff, and how you can use it. I think it's great for giving you ideas and starting points to move forward from. But you're right, it very much focuses on what information is out there and summarizes that to make life more effective. And for some parts, it can work really, really well. So there's massive uses of ChatGPT in social media marketing and that kind of stuff. There's huge gains that you can have by doing that. But actually, when it comes to general practice, there are some really cool things you could do with it if it wasn't for the fact that you can't actually put patient data in ChatGPT, because that's wrong. And it's you shouldn't be doing that. But an AI model to use in general practice that is safe to use, now that I think could be really interesting. We covered that like you said, in that episode with myself and Keith. So if you do want to see some examples how you can use AI in general practice, definitely check out that episode because you will enjoy it.
So, Gandhi, what I wanted to ask you about is not necessarily using this as a patient-facing technology, but I'm thinking about health policy, because
Okay.
I can see a world in a few years' time where not just in health policy, but all sorts of government policy and maybe even international foreign affairs and diplomacy, that governments have their public or even proprietary large language models, and that they
Mm.
ask questions to start to inform policy, or at least generate kind of policy
Mm.
ideas for people to work up. And one of those areas will be health policy. I mean, do you think this may lead to better health policy? We've been critical of some of the stuff the government's done in the last few
Yeah,
years, and
I
maybe
think that's
feel
probably
that
a bit
it's done for the
trickier
wrong
because of.
reasons,
Mm.
for media reasons and so forth. Do you think we'll be steered away from that, or will they just get even better at, at using the language models to do more of that? What do you think?
I mean, I think it's possible. I think it's trickier because where is that? It all comes down to what sample data you're using the language models on. So is that what is actually existing and stuff? And that's one of the things that often is criticized about ChatGPT. That for example, if you look at the evidence that it provides or the referencing and stuff, that's where it falls down, because actually it's not great at picking a lot of that stuff up. Yes, there's been loads of commentary about how ChatGPT passed the medical exam, or ChatGPT passed the bar and that kind of stuff. But that's because that's fixed, unified information. When it comes to more principles, innovation, that's where it really struggles, because it doesn't have that capability. That's what humans have. We are the best at coming up with those innovative ideas, because that's the way our brains work and stuff. So I think using it in terms of directing health policy, I think it's a good, like I said, it's a good place to potentially look at starting from, initiating the discussion, but it's not going to be a replacement for human beings in terms of how it works and stuff in that sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. Seems really good at providing, summaries, pulling together kind of research, pulling together concepts and things. But in terms of sort of pulling all of that together and doing something new and
Mhm.
different and solving new problems looking
Yeah,
forwards, I get the sense that it's not quite there yet. But it should make a lot of knowledge work like policy formulation quicker in
quicker.
terms of it doing a lot of that mundane work and leaving human minds to focus on where they can add value. So yeah, so maybe I've got fingers crossed for better health policy with sort of just better informational availability and visibility. So we will see. So maybe that's a reason to be optimistic, which it feels like sometimes we're not on this podcast. So
No.
if maybe we take the win and end there or thereabouts this morning.
Sure. I guess just worth mentioning a couple of things. So thank you to those that have commented in the chat. So I asked the question, will you be supporting the junior doctors strike or are you against them? Interesting, we had a different perspective. So JC Melody, 100% full support. Narisharo Gure, I'm not quite sure what you're saying, to be honest, but people have money more than they're earning under different name like inflation, etc.
I'm not sure, but people love money. That's a universal truth. I'll
Yeah.
take that.
And then we've had a question come through, Andy. So I'm going to ask this one to you. Are we going to see the return of NHS health checks? Do you think they'll bin quaff, spirometry, and vaccine work? Interesting question.
That's a good question. I guess NHS health checks and payment for them has still been there, right, Gandhi? I think over 45 NHS health checks. I know we paused them during COVID. I think they are back at my surgery.
Yep.
I think we will see a return of those. I think they're a good way of picking up disease, early, in those people just as they're entering middle age at 45, 40, not quite there yet. Gandhi and I don't think, not quite. Will they been quaff, spirometry and vaccine work? I don't know. I think the talk of I think probably not specifically. I know availability of spirometry is an issue for some reasons which are complicated. Probably won't go into here, but in terms of changes of training and who can do them and so forth. But I think it's more a question of the future QOF itself, I guess. And will QOF be replaced by something else? And the indications are that it might be. I think looking at the content of some of the documents coming out of government. So I don't know if that's an answer. That's probably a little bit of a smudge, really. Any thoughts on that, Gandhi, before we end?
Like you say, we're waiting the outcomes of the current negotiation for the GP contract, which is really interesting because it should have been out by now. It should have been out almost 2 months ago. It's still not out. I probably suspect it'll come out on the 30th of March, as the best time to bring out a new contract for how you're going to do the work and stuff. And whether QOF stays, like you say, I think it's interesting. For the past 2-3 years, there's been a cessation of QOF. This year, some areas are not legally, they can't stop QOF from happening, but they are backfilling, or I've forgotten the term itself, but make sure practices are reimbursed for the QOF work because they're focused more on acute care. The one that I find really interesting is the vaccine stuff. I've not been shy about criticizing NHS England. I personally feel they have massively driven health inequalities with their vaccine work that they've done for when it comes to both QOF and IAF in terms of reducing funding to deprived areas, either by design or by intent. And unfortunately, I think that definitely has to change. I think, NHS England or the Treasury or whoever is responsible for that particular decision have made a massive and categorical error in the way that they've commissioned the services and stuff. And how, unfortunately, I think we're going to see negative health outcomes from that decision in the years to come for our populations, and more importantly, for the funding of practices who are not going to be able to maintain their staff because of those active decisions that they have made. So that does need to change, in my view. And if it doesn't, we are going to see even further deepening of problems for general practices and stuff. So time will tell, I think, is the ultimate thing. It is interesting that is something we are partly going to be discussing at our upcoming event, Andy. So it's probably worth that we mention this, that obviously on Wednesday, so if you're watching this live now, you hopefully catch this, but on the 1st of March, myself and Andy will be running a hybrid conference here in Nottingham, which you can still join remotely. Unfortunately, I think all the in-person tickets are gone. So if you haven't signed up now, I'm afraid you missed the boat. But you can join us remotely for our PCN Plus conference. So this is part of the work that me and you do as our PCN Plus course for CDs. But we're running a conference to talk about some of the interesting challenges that are coming for PCNs in particular in the final year of PCNs, as many people are thinking of it at the moment. because I suspect there'll be a new iteration of whatever they are, either continued or something else. And joined by obviously our amazing colleagues, Ben Gowland from the General Practice Podcast and Tara Humphreys from the Business for Healthcare Podcast, and some extra guests and stuff coming to talk about various things and stuff. We're really looking forward to this. It's going to be an interesting event. We're running it hybridly as well, which is going to be a twist, I think. But yeah, if you want to sign up, the link will be down in the descriptions and stuff, bit.ly/PCM+23, all lowercase, and that will take you straight up so you can sign up as ever and get access to recordings like you can with all of our conference stuff, including our next one, which is GP5T3 as well. So for those GP trainers out there watching and listening and stuff, feel free to join us on the 18th of March for GP5T3, which is our trainers conference that we run virtually, and we've got some amazing content in that one that's coming forward for people, and that's bit.ly/GP5T523. I had to come up with some weird numbers and stuff, but that's all uppercase and stuff, and you can definitely jump in and join.
Yeah, but take a look, and people can look at the programs there as well, can't they? When they go on those links and see if they fancy some of the talks and content.
Mm-hmm. So we did mention about the various other stuff that's coming through. In the next few weeks, me and Andy have got some really cool things coming. 2 weeks time, we're going to be live at AirCon. So that'll be interesting. And as well, if you do want to check out...
Which is a board game conference, by the way.
Yes, it's a board game conference. So we're doing some health stuff as well. Yeah. So we're running a park run, we're supporting the running of a park run at a board game conference. So that'll be really cool. And we're looking forward to it. I'm sure me and Andy will be doing live at some points and stuff to cover it as well. And if you did want to check out that episode by Keith Grimes and myself on ChatGPT, have a look right here, because that'll be coming up shortly for you. And as always, we're here to help tech enhance your primary care and learning, and we will catch you in the next episode.